Good morning, good-looking people, and you're good-looking because you're always looking, and of course you are finding the good in everything and in everybody. Hope you're well. Hope you had a nice Shabbos. So we're doing yesterday's Hayom Yom, which is for the 3rd of Shvat. It's a little bit longer today. It's very informative, and we're drawing comparisons between the Alter Rebbe and also Moshe Rabbeinu, where Moshe Rabbeinu was known that he wrote the written law, which is the 5 books of Torah. It also mentions that the beginning of the oral law actually started from Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshas Devarim, that when he started giving it over before he passed on, this was the beginning of the oral law. And it says that after he actually wrote down, at the end of his life, he wrote all the Sefer Torahs, whatever he had mentioned already in Chumash Devarim, is then eventually he wrote it down. Now, what's being talked about today is the same of the Alter Rebbe. There's the written Chassidus, and there's also the oral law of Chassidus. So the comparison is that the Tanya is actually considered the written Torah of Chassidus, and Torah Or and Likutei Torah, which are two others farm based on all the Maimarim of the Alter Rebbe, those are considered the oral law of Chassidus. Now, we're going to go through a lot of the details of when they were printed and what was included in every sefer, and then I'll do my best to try to give you some notes through the text. But really important, just to go to the message up front here, is the Rebbe comments that just like how important it is that we talk about that on Shabbos we need to be Ma'avir Sedra, which means we say Shnei Mikra V'Chatargum, reading the Chumash twice in its text and once in Onkelos. Just as that is important, the same thing is the Chassidish Torah and the Chassidish Parsha, that every week not only do we have to read the text on the written side, but also we need to study the Maimarim from Likutei Torah and also from Torah Or. They are just as important as we'll read here inside. And the Tzemach Tzedek played a major role. The Tzemach Tzedek wrote down the majority of the Alter Rebbe's Maimarim. The Alter Rebbe gave them over orally, just like he did it with the Tanya. Eventually the Hasidim were studying the Tanya and then they were printing it. And when there were a lot of mistakes, that's when he went to actual printing and made it official. And the same thing with all the Maimarim. He gave it over, and the Tzemach Tzedek took upon himself to really write them all down. However, he did have help from 4 people. So from the Alter Rebbe, the 4 people that were involved in writing them down was his brother Rabbi Yehuda Leib, his son, which was the Mittler Rebbe, the grandson we talked about, which was the Tzemach Tzedek, and also there was a chassid by the name of Reb Pinchas Reizes. They really took upon themselves, and the Tzemach Tzedek really taking the lead of putting all of the Alter Rebbe's Maimarim down on paper. Okay, let's read the Hayom Yom inside for the 3rd of Shvat. Torah Or was first published in 1837 in Kapost, without its appendices. In a letter of the 3rd of Shvat of that year, the Tzemach Tzedek writes as follows. Torah Or, which was published now, includes most of the Maimarim that the Alter Rebbe delivered between 1795 and at the end of 1812. Many of them were critically read and edited by our master himself, referring to the Alter Rebbe, and he gave his consent for their publication. Again, drawing like we talked about the Tanya, the same thing, very into making sure that the edited version was finalized properly with all the correct texts. This work comprised of 2 different parts. The first part, which includes Maimarim on the first 2 Chamoshim, which were Bereishis and Shmos, on Chanukah and Purim, some Maimarim on Shavuos and the season of the giving of the Torah, which are also included in Parshas Yisro, and a few on Pesach and Parshas Vayakel. Now, just a quick note, the first 2 Chumashim are really the winter time. So why did the Alter Rebbe add also Shavuos, some stuff on Pesach, and stuff about giving of the Torah, which is later on? And the answer is, or one of the answers that are given, they were planning to print the second Sefer right away, but just in case that it wouldn't have been printed, they would have these available, and that's exactly what happened. It took 11 years before they were able to print the second version, or the second, excuse me, not the second version, the second book. And therefore, having those Maimarim now as part of the first book was very helpful to the Hasidim. Let's continue reading. With God's help, the second part, which includes the Maimarim on this last three Chumashim, which were Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim, on Shir Hashirim, and some of the festivals on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So I think I jumped a little bit there, but basically the first book had Bereshis and Shmos, and what we talked about, and the second Sefer would have Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim, and stuff on the holidays and Rosh Hashanah and Shir Hashirim and Yom Kippur, and that's where the note takes place, why he added some of the other Maimarim for Shavuos and Pesach in the first book. Continuing, it says, the name of the author Shneir, which benefits him, just as Ve'ahavta and Shalav, is twice the numerical equivalent of Or. So the Alter Rebbe's name was Shneir. Shneir stands for two lights, Shnei Or. And it also says that if you look at the gematria of Shneir, Or, which is light, which is the gematria of 207, and if you were to double 207, you get 414, which is Ve'ahavta, which means and to love, which is the epitome of the Alter Rebbe. Continuing to the last portion here, it says, at the time they managed to publish only the first volume, for due to the allegations of informers, the government closed several Jewish printing houses in Russia, including the one in Kaputz, where Torah Or was printed. So therefore, in 1848, which was 11 years later, the second volume was printed in Zhytomyr, but with a different title known as Likutei Torah. So there's a lot of information here. It's actually very interesting. But we have Likutei Torah and we have Torah Or. Both of those are essential as literally they are the oral law of Hasidus Torah, of what they call the Hasidic Parshas. And the Rebbe makes a very interesting point here. Just as important as we are learning Chumash and Rashi and being Maver Sedra on Shabbos, we really need to make time to also learn the Maimarim from the Likutei Torah and Torah Or, as it's mentioned here in this Hayom Yom. And it's also important to remember that the Tzemach Tzedek really took upon himself a lot to make sure that all these Maimarim were not only just put down, but documented correctly, and he worked with the Alter Rebbe to make sure that they were accurate when they were printed. I know it's a lot, but it's all here and it's great. It's good information. Have a wonderful day. Have a great and successful week, and we will talk more in a little bit.